Our next guest is Sarah Rosier. Sarah is one of our Ballotpedia All-Stars and also a repeat guest, so we're looking forward to her comments today. Sarah is the Congress Project Director at Ballotpedia, and if I remember last time when I introduced Sarah, I said Congress is definitely a project, so I don't envy her job. And today she's got a really great topic, and I don't even know what we're going to talk about, but the topic is what are moneymaker districts? So if you've got the Congress Project Director and you're talking about moneymaker districts, I'm sure you're headed towards a great conversation. So Sarah, welcome to the show.
Hi, how are you?
So I guess you've caught my attention. What is a moneymaker district?
So part of our coverage in 2014 was to identify, as we discussed in my last appearance, which battleground districts exist for the 2014 elections. And one thing we wanted to look at to kind of shape our coverage this year is which districts in 2012 were called competitive but ended up not being competitive, which is a margin of victory of 10 percentage points or less. So there were 29 districts that we're calling moneymakers, which means that race outlets like Cook and Larry Sabato's Crystal Ball, they were calling these districts competitive, but in reality, these 29 districts ended up with a margin of victory of, I believe it was 14.3 percentage points on average of a win for the incumbent. So that's a really big margin of victory, especially when they were being touted as competitive and so much money was being put into them because they were being considered competitive. So what we wanted to look at was how much more money these competitive races, these competitive money makers, which truly didn't end up being competitive, were being given by outside groups, how much money was being put into the candidates' war chests when they didn't end up really being competitive. The average House race in 2012 cost $2.1 million. The average moneymaker district was spending $1.4 million more than that, which was $3.5 million on average for these moneymaker districts. So that ended up being a total of $39.6 million spent on these districts that were being hyped as competitive, but then didn't show the real signs of actually having a race. So that's what we were looking at in 2012, and that's what we'll hope to evaluate after the race is over.
Well, this is a very interesting concept. I know my viewers know this. You may not know this. My day job is actually as a lobbyist, and as you might imagine, I get calls around the clock for people wanting to raise money.
Right.
If a day doesn't go by. So you'll get a call from someone and they'll say, I'm raising money for a race. It's a really competitive race. It's really close. I really need the money. And then, of course, as you suggest, then they win by 30 points. So it wasn't close at all. So, but they're raising money, which I guess they need to do, right? The mother's milk. So how do you find that? Do you think this is being staged to a certain extent?
Well, there's kind of a mutual benefit for both the media who's touting these races as competitive and then also the candidates themselves. When you have these race outlets like Cook, like Fair Vote, calling, I think there were upwards of 80 competitive races in 2012, even though really only about 30 were truly competitive. But you have that mutual relationship there. If the media is talking about it, then they're getting attention for they're getting page views, they're getting subscriptions because they have all these marquee races that you can't miss any of the details about. But then you also have the candidates who would love for their race to be considered competitive because that just allows them to build and build and build their money war chests. So there really isn't a desire for anybody to come out and say, actually, the competitiveness is pretty low in House races. So that's what we kind of wanted to step in and do for 2014.
Now, for these races that were perceived to be by someone to be competitive, where you said they didn't end up being competitive, part of your definition of competitiveness is predicted to be within 10 points, correct?
Right.
See, to me, that I wouldn't even consider that competitive, quite frankly. I think maybe a predicted swing of 5 points or less might be competitive.
Right.
So you're already being fairly generous at 10 points, and then these races are ending up being 14-point swings.
Right.
I mean, that's almost landslide territory where I come from. So
It is. And it's really, although we haven't looked at the money being poured into some of the lesser competitive races, so some of the, right now we have 26 races that we've identified for 2014. So other Cook is still around 72, Fairboat's still up there as well. Although we haven't looked at those 30 some odd races that we're not calling competitive and how much money is being dumped into them, just because we're still in the middle of primary season, we're still seeing money being funneled for that purpose rather than the general. We are noticing some trends. Yeah, Shelley Moore Capito in West Virginia is giving up her House seat to run for the Senate. She was winning that district by over 30 percentage points. And I believe Cook is calling that race a likely R. It's listed under the competitive section, which to me, yes, it's an open seat, but look at, you got to look at the numbers in the past too. And that's not going to be competitive at all. So it is interesting as you kind of put it in that framework to say, wait a second, we're getting a lot of hype about this or that, and it's not going to really materialize into much.
Well, some of this may relate to polling. There's pollsters that are always predicting races, and to a certain extent, they're almost always wrong.
Right.
In this case, you may have a different definition of competitiveness than some of these other people do, and maybe their standard of competitiveness just isn't tight enough.
Right. So the polling issue is interesting, but it's almost like sometimes the media ignores the polls. So, you had Georgia's Senate race where the polling was pretty much off for the runoff primary, where the guy in the lead just didn't end up winning. We had a surprise dark horse victory there. You also have races like Michigan where, whether or not people want to believe it, Terry Lynn Land has been trailing in the polls by 5+ percentage points for a long time, but it's still considered one of the most competitive Senate races by a lot of the media outlets, and we hear about that one almost every day. So it is interesting to see which polls people are paying attention to. It's almost like if the polling goes and, oh, this is a competitive race, then the media picks it up and, oh, look at this poll, it points to that being competitive. But on the flip side, if the poll does show a pretty substantial margin of victory predicted, then it's almost kind of ignored and the race is still considered competitive and the narrative still continues.
So if it's being considered competitive, as you said, maybe it benefits the news outlets and others, because if it's called competitive, the longer it's called competitive, the more money gets raised, the more money gets spent. It's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, at least on the money-making side, right?
Right, yep.
Now, when you saw the increase in money in these districts that were being called competitive, was it fairly balanced, or is this inuring to the benefit of the incumbents?
I would say that it could go either way depending on the race. There are some very big, one big area where there was some money being raised was in both Florida and Illinois, where there was a lot of incumbent versus incumbents just because of redistricting. So that was a very interesting case, because if you really looked at the numbers and you looked at the makeup of the district, you could easily tell who was going to win those races. But because there were two incumbents, because it was an incumbent fighting an incumbent for the seat, there was just so much money being spent on both sides. And we'll see a little less of that this year. There haven't been, unless this Florida redistricting thing, the lawsuit comes to a boiling, but that should be less of this year. So we'll be able to really pinpoint who's spending the most, whether or not it's these anti-incumbency surges or if it is just incumbents trying to hold on to their seats.
Now, when you also see the increase in money, I don't know if you've looked at the statistics behind this. I'm having trouble saying statistics today. I don't know if you've looked at them. I'll just say them. If you've looked at them, is there an increase in money coming from different places with this increased money? For instance, out of state? I know the Kentucky Senate race right now, there's ads addressing how much money comes from out of state. So as the races get more competitive, are you seeing more out of district money, or have you not had a chance to look at that?
That usually is the trend. We haven't evaluated that yet for 2014 just because a lot of them are just starting to heat up. But in a lot of those 2012, once you hit kind of that average threshold, a lot of the money being spent over the $2.1 million is coming from out of state. And then again, you also have races. John Boehner, the majority of his money comes from out of state just because he's the speaker. And you see that with a lot of the leadership campaigns. But we will be able to get a better handle on how much is coming from out of state with 2014.
Now you mentioned Florida, and I know there was a judge that said some of the districts weren't drawn properly. So will they be redrawn by the 2014 election, or I don't know how that plays out?
I'm not sure how it's playing out. I know there is speculation just as recently as today that the election dates would be pushed back. So that'll be another big case that could get all the way to Supreme Court. So we'll have to sit back and wait for that one. But that could be a big mess down in Florida this year.
Because again, we were talking about how Ballotpedia defines competitiveness and how other people define competitiveness. When you have a new district drawn, that would obviously have to be considered for competitiveness. One of the factors.
Yeah. And I mean, Florida had a big shakeup in 2012 because of redistricting. So it'll be interesting down there.
But again, you're looking at federal level, and right now you're predicting only 26 competitive races.
Yes.
And even the biggest number I think you threw out, Cook or someone, was 70 competitive races.
Yeah, we're still seeing, and it appears just from what we had done in 2012 that as you get closer to the election, more races magically become competitive. So we're trying to allow for change in our study if something major happens in Congress and it does look like an incumbent is vulnerable. We have always said that we'll go back and add a competitive race or add this or that, add that. But we did want to keep it to a level that we really think these are the districts that you can expect a 5 or less margin of victory. This is our first time taking a shot at it. So I'm despite my own inklings, I hope that there aren't too many switches and that we kind of are on the money here with our predictions. I'm really looking forward to see how well we fared.
Well, I'm sure you'll do great in that regard. Let me throw you a bit of a curve, possibly. You talk about moneymaker districts, and you're generally speaking about the general election, correct?
Yes.
Are you seeing the same moneymaker phenomenon in primary elections?
Well, this cycle has been especially odd. Only in the one instant, Eric Cantor, this was just a very strange primary cycle in Virginia. We saw the runoff in Texas with Ralph Hall losing, and then we also saw the Mississippi Senate runoff. Mississippi Senate runoff, there was a lot of money. Virginia 7th? No. So it is really the difference between the primary and general spending is very interesting, just because sometimes those primary competitions sneak up on you. It may not be expected. Nobody predicted the Cantor race would be competitive. Nobody. It was a huge surprise to me that night. So it is interesting to see if the race is predicted as competitive, and we knew McDaniel had a shot at Cochran. Everybody was dumping money in the race from the very start. That one, there was a lot of money. But some of these other primary races may not come to full speed as quickly as that one did.
Now, my viewers know, I'm old, I'm cynical. You're young, you're probably not cynical yet, but when you started talking about moneymaker districts, and I was talking to you about my experience with people that call me to raise money, sometimes I'm getting calls from people and they're pretending to have a competitive race, whether they know it or not, or they're just saying they have a competitive race, because they actually are asked by their leaders to raise money to funnel to other places. So, but it seems to me you were suggesting that the money's being raised in the moneymaker districts is actually getting spent there, as opposed to moving somewhere else.
Yeah, so the one thing that does distinguish the two is somebody like Boehner, his district wouldn't fit into our moneymaker just because nobody was calling it competitive. So you're exactly right. In that case, I can absolutely see some of the leadership running in their own districts, trying to drum up attention for it, and then being able to use their leadership packs to kind of funnel the money to other districts to help other people. But we really wanted to focus on those districts where they were being actively called competitive, And most of the money did end up being spent in that district because those candidates probably did believe that they had a shot, or that they had really tough competition.
Well, it's interesting that you're tracking this data, because I'm finding more and more people look at money as the root evil cause there of politics, and this moneymaker phenomenon. It'll be interesting to see what happens at the 2014 elections, and maybe we'll pick this up with you, 6 or 8 months from now when you've looked at the statistics, and see if this concept of yours is playing true.
Yeah, I'm really hoping it does. We're hoping that this study can translate throughout the election cycles here and predict pretty well.
Well, thank you, Sarah. You're one of my favorite Ballotpedia All-Stars, and always gracious of you to join us as a guest. Thanks again.
Thanks for having me.